Mnar is here because we are trying to focus this year on voices of the other, on voices that are not too often heard in contemporary discussion of issues. And that's a sort of a difficult issue sometimes. Who do you define as the other? Because in a society like ours, there are many others. And we feel that Mnar will be a very good representative of her point of view. Mnar said that MintPress, which is she's founder and editor-in-chief, focuses its coverage on issues relating to the effects of special interest groups, big business, and lobbying efforts, as well as monopoly capitalism on policies at home and abroad. Through the lens of social justice and human rights, MintPress reports on how these dynamics drive our foreign affairs, globalization, and war, and examine the effects they have on our policy, democracy, and freedoms as defined by the U.S. Constitution. I think I'll let Mnar take over from there. So please welcome Mnar and Muhawesh.
In a world that seems mirrored with war and hate, it's pretty admirable and encouraging to continue to come and speak within a long-standing organization that continues to bring people from all walks of life and brings people together for the cause of peace to share the stories that are often censored, ignored, disenfranchised, and even smeared by the corporate media. Now, I was told that there would be some hecklers tonight in the audience who said that they were concerned. They found it really suspicious that a young woman, let alone a Muslim woman, was capable of starting a journalism organization. Now, despite the obvious sexism in that statement that in the United States in 2015, it's almost impossible for a woman to start her own business, what I found most interesting about those concerns were just how fitting it was for tonight's event, an event that was dedicated to speak about how we treat Muslims as others, Muslims as suspect. So in which tonight I'll be addressing how Muslims have been really smeared in the media. This sort of white privilege Orientalism, the sentiment that Muslim women are incapable of being educated, intelligent, independent, financially successful, has ironically highlighted the prejudices that we have deep inside ourselves. I mean, just imagine if I were in the Middle East today, in a country like Iran or Saudi Arabia, where there aren't, which don't have very good human rights records, and a group of people tried to censor me from speaking at an event because they couldn't believe a woman could start her own business. Let's be honest here, it would probably be on the front page of Fox News in the center of a discussion about how women are oppressed in the Middle East. And just this summer, this actually reminded me of an event that happened this summer where a woman refused to be picked up by a hijabi. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just this summer, a woman refused to be picked up by a hijabi Muslim Uber driver. She filed a complaint to Uber, really disgusted that they would allow a Muslim woman to be a driver. Now, this story went totally viral, and thanks to social media and people on the internet, they went on her Facebook page to check her, her post to see what this woman was about, why she didn't want this Muslim woman to be her driver. And they found a lot of prejudices on her page. And ironically, she had written a lot about how women are oppressed in Saudi Arabia, that they couldn't drive. Yet, here we are in the United States, and she was trying to stop a woman from being a driver for Uber. But the truth is, this kind of Orientalism against Muslims in general, and Muslim women in general, who are becoming more prominent in the media in challenging the perspectives about Islam, about women in Islam, about the recolonization of the Middle East and Africa that's taking place today, is the result of over 14 years of warmongering and fearmongering by the corporate press. Our corporate media is now owned by 6 corporations: General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. And if you heard that right and were paying very close attention, that means that the defense industry, the arms industry, the cable and entertainment industries, like the powers that be in Hollywood, control over 90% of what 300 million Americans see, hear, and read. So statistically, for every 50 million Americans, one corporation provides their news. So how we learn and hear about the world and even about what's going on in our own nations is through one lens, which is the media. But because of this consolidation, we went from being owned by 50 corporations in 1983 to just 6 by the year 2001. No, 2001. Never has this lens, the media, been more narrow, more extreme, and more manipulative than it is today. And it begs the question why stories like ISIS, Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons, Donald Trump's racist rants and raves, Hillary Clinton's emails, and those cute cat videos choke up the airwaves while other really important stories go under the radar. Through the process of this consolidation and corporate ownership, the entities the press is meant to hold accountable became the owners of that media. These media corporations literally spend billions of dollars to craft stories that distract, fearmonger, entertain, and propagandize rather than inform. They've effectively turned the media into a lapdog for those in power, dulling the teeth of the watchdog the First Amendment was written to protect. Now, I'm just going to take a sip of my water here quickly. Since the US launched its official war on terror in 2001, or right after 9/11, a new era erupted in the American press. A general climate of fear and anger that was directed and fomented towards American Muslims erupted, as seen in the civilization of jihad. That's how Muslims in the Middle East were continuously described as. And then included in that was also very biased media coverage of American wars that were nothing more than for oil in the Middle East. Now, this climate of fear has manifested itself for the past 14 years in institutional policies that view American Muslims as a threat and are treated as suspect when doing just about anything, from going to the grocery store, to working in media, to working in business, to whatever they are doing. Now, despite most of the 9/11 hijackers being from Saudi Arabia, President Bush went on to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, two nations strategically located in a resource-rich region, still untouched by multinational corporations, and regions which could later act as a military buffer zone to Russia and China's growing influence. Now, despite the US's long history of funding and arming both the brutal dictatorships of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and terrorist mujahideen movements in Afghanistan, the United States entered a new era of endless war, resource grabbing, fomenting civil strife, supporting more right-wing militias, and spreading American-style democracy, or what we like to call monopoly capitalism. Take the Iraq War, for example, which is many things to different people. But if we look to Hollywood war porn movies like the recent American Sniper, the Iraq War was a patriotic mission defending American freedoms and values abroad. Even though the movie was released 12 years after September 11th, the producers attempted to insult our intelligence by rewriting the US's destruction of Iraq by tying 9/11 to Saddam Hussein and to justify the war. This was 12 years after 9/11. Now, Chris Kyle, the Navy SEAL who the Hollywood box office was based off of, wrote a book by the same name that encapsulates his hatred, bigotry, and enthusiasm for killing Iraqi savages. And I bring this up because in his book, the way he described regular Iraqis really is a microcosm of the way the American press in general portrays Muslims and Arabs alike to foment fear and justify these military operations. He wrote, "Savage, despicable, evil. That's what we were fighting in Iraq. That's why a lot of people, including myself, called the enemy savages. There really was no other way to describe what we encountered there." This caricature that has been painted by the media that Muslims are just savages is also responsible for the rise of hate crimes that have targeted American Muslims. Just this summer, I found myself and my family at the center of a hate crime because of this growing Islamophobia. My own parents were held at gunpoint. because a blonde, white, middle-aged suburban mom thought they looked suspicious. My parents, who are both Palestinian American, my mother wears the hijab just like I do. My father, just a middle-aged 50-year-old man with darker complexion, were waiting to pick up my 16-year-old brother from a friend's house in their car in Brooklyn Park. The woman approached my parents with her gun pointed at them, and she asked them what they were doing in that neighborhood. And she said, my parents both said, we're here to pick up our son from this house. And the woman didn't believe them. She said, I don't believe you. I don't believe you're kind. My parents were doing nothing else but there to pick up their son. Of course, we pressed charges. The woman is now facing, a court hearing actually in December. But this really hit home because of my work in journalism and monitoring this rise of Islamophobia. Now, despite the nearly 2 million civilian casualties that were murdered in the Iraq War that we rarely hear about, for big companies, however, the war in Iraq was a lucrative cash cow for over 25 multinational corporations, including oil, construction, agriculture, equity, and banking industries. Take, for example, Dick Cheney's former company, Halliburton, which gained $17.2 billion in the Iraq War-related revenue from 2003 to 2006. But the often censored part of these Western wars in the Middle East is the human cost. We talked about the Iraq War, which was 2 million deaths. But since 1990, it's been estimated that up to 8 million Muslims have died directly due to direct and indirect military operations in just Iraq and Afghanistan. Now take a second to think about that. 8 million innocent civilians. We are not talking about terrorist groups here. We're talking about regular, innocent people. Now, this report was released a few months ago by the Nobel Peace Prize winning doctors based in DC, Physicians for Social Responsibility. And surprisingly, CNN recently released a statistic just last month at the last shooting here in the US that showed that since 2001, 3,000 Americans died due to terrorism. Americans are more likely to be killed by right-wing hate groups with guns in the United States. So the big question here, and why we're all here tonight, is how do politicians justify the murder of 8 million Muslims and convince the masses that these wars are being fought for human rights? This is the most important question that we ask tonight, because in this climate of fear, most of us are wondering, where are all the Muslim voices? Why aren't they talking? Why aren't they speaking up against extremism? Because it can really help us understand how this climate of fear is crafted and war is typically sold to the public. Well, the answer is simple. Just like anything else, you have to follow the money. In fact, Islamophobia is such a hot topic that it's literally an industry worth $200 million per year in the United States. And this was revealed in an in-depth report by the Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. You can find the full report online, of course, and on our website. The pro-Israel Republican donor Sheldon Adelson, the Koch brothers, Newton and Rochelle Becker, the Sarah Scaife Foundation, and the Bradley Foundation are just a few big names responsible for a huge portion of funding that industry. Now, these same donors, though, many of whom are invested in industries like the defense, oil, banking, construction, and others that profit from war and current instability in the Middle East. But they also have one thing in common, which is they're part of this 1% global elite club that now own over 60% of the world's wealth. And guess what? Nobody in this room is invited to that club. So, too bad. But what this industry really is just a divide and conquer tactic so that we may point our fingers at each other, at this invisible enemy, spread hate, while those at the very top continue to exploit the wealth of the masses across the globe. Coincidentally, our friends at the celebrity gossip website BuzzFeed just so happened to share some of the very same financiers. In 2013, the Israeli Defense Forces, or the IDF, announced that BuzzFeed would be its official mouthpiece in the United States. And that's according to The Atlantic and NPR. Their reasoning was to influence a young American audience, since most people that go to BuzzFeed are there for entertainment news, to ensure a long-standing support for Israel and its foreign policy. That same year, BuzzFeed launched its political section, which should probably be called the State Department and Israeli Press Release Center, that went after every progressive movement and journalist. And it also just so happened to echo the Islamophobia industry's talking points in its new politics section by promoting a US and Israeli foreign policy agenda to dehumanize Muslims. In the process, the site launched an organized gossip-style ad hominem attack against several anti-Zionist journalists and Palestinian activists, and also progressive causes, which I found myself falling victim to. Other prominent journalists targeted by BuzzFeed at the same time have been Max Blumenthal, who is a very well-known Jewish journalist and author who writes about Israeli colonialism, occupation, and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. But we noticed we all had one thing in common because it happened all at the same time. We did two things. We, of course, we exposed the unchecked Israeli colonialism and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, but we also questioned the true reasons for US war and meddling in Syria. So long gone are the days of simply being a Hamas sympathizer. Remember those days when you'd support Palestine and you'd be called a Hamas sympathizer? Well, the labels have gotten a little bit more sophisticated now. With the rise of ISIS and Iran-Israel relations at an all-time high, these major news stories offered the Islamophobia network and industry a new opportunity to leverage unrelated geopolitical events in order to create a caricature of Muslim Americans by fomenting this public anxiety surrounding them. If you spoke out against war, you are now branded as a terrorist sympathizer being bankrolled by ISIS or the Muslim Brotherhood, who is infiltrating America and even our president, or you are a government agent of Iran. Now, this of course sets a very dangerous precedent for journalists trying to do the very job our corporate media has failed to do in working to inform the public about the gruesome realities of failed US foreign policy that has been driven by fomenting civil strife, allowing the flow of arms in terror networks' hands, supporting right-wing groups, and grabbing of resources abroad. Now, having said all of this, I have spent the past 15 years, since I was 13 years old, as Dick had mentioned, speaking about this very subject. At 9, I was a little too young to start speaking about it, but at 13, I was, starting mature enough to speak about these kinds of things. It's really no coincidence that I've chosen this path of speaking up against injustice, whether it's through exposing the puppeteers behind media manipulation, neoconservative attacks on peace movements, or war profiteering, and really defending Muslims' right to speak at events like this. Perhaps it's because everything I've shared with you today about war, targeting of Muslims, media manipulation, and this overall climate of fear that we've all fell victim to, these issues have literally affected every aspect of my life and defined who I am today as a Muslim American. I'm certainly not alone, because it's important to hear this from a personal perspective from myself. But this is a story that I'm about to share with you is one of trials and tribulations, an identity crisis, and standing firm and tall against the wind. And I'd like to do that by sharing my personal story with you. From my early childhood, I learned the hard way that wars were never really about defending human rights. Bombing people to save people just never made sense to me. Growing up in the United States, I actually didn't even know anything about being a Palestinian or being about the Palestinian heritage and culture, military occupation in Palestine, let alone about the religion of Islam. I grew up in a very secular Palestinian family. But one day, when I was about 9 years old, my parents decided it was time to move the entire family back home to Jerusalem to be closer to their family and to learn more about our Palestinian heritage. I was young, I was again just 9 years old. I didn't speak a word of Arabic, and I had no idea how this move would eventually change my life forever and impact my decisions as an adult. Well, we moved to Jerusalem in 1997, We assimilated. I got to meet my parents' friends, make new friends, and meet the family, visit historic and tourist holy sites, Christian churches, Muslim mosques, Jewish temples. I know that many of you in the audience have actually visited Jerusalem, which is an amazing experience. The people and geography were a sight to remember. The skies were always clear. The sun was always shining. Everyone you meet smiles at you, whether Jewish or Muslim or Christian. They invite you into their home for a meal or for some tea. But all of these details aside, it was really hard not to notice, even at 9 years old, that we had just moved into apartheid and a semi-war zone under colonial occupation. The first year we lived in Jerusalem, things were a bit calm politically. I was able to go to school regularly and didn't have any issues. But soon into the second and third years, the Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, had erupted. Now, by the time I was 12 years old, I had already witnessed human rights abuses by a state that had convinced the world that it was a civilized democracy and the natives of the land were savages. I witnessed Palestinians subjected to discriminatory laws, having their travel controlled, living behind a 30-foot-high concrete apartheid wall, separating them from the world. Every day for the people of Palestine was a matter of survival while living under martial law and military occupation. I was surrounded with thoughts of children being killed by bombs, families left homeless from airstrikes, electricity and water getting cut off regularly, and entire cities having their water literally poisoned by Israeli settlers. Men and young boys were abducted by police in the middle of the night during raids and being held in indefinite detention without any trial and charges as well. I would cross through checkpoints where the taxi driver would yell "duck" because Israeli soldiers would be shooting rubber bullets at them, at young children, because they were throwing rocks at them because they were being blocked from going to school. I would go to school at 6th and 7th grade with nearly half the seats empty in my classroom because the rest of those kids were blocked from crossing armed checkpoints. Soldiers were always pointing guns at citizens. They were roaming the streets freely. Israeli settlers would kidnap children and plant bombs at Palestinian elementary schools. It was a common occurrence. Actually, the same month that we had arrived back to the United States, my aunt had called us and said that she had to evacuate her school because settlers had planted a bomb at her son's elementary school. I was traumatized, to say the least. Now, I didn't come here to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I wanted to use the media coverage of Israel and Palestine as an example of just how irresponsible the media has been covering conflicts in the Middle East accurately. What the media has done for this conflict, however, is break it down in language that they are just very good at, which is, it's a religious fight. It's Muslims versus Jew. They describe it as Palestinians, as Muslim militants who want to kill all Jews and annihilate the state of Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, using the pretext of the Holocaust to increase sentiment, when I described this experience with you, if you noticed, I didn't even mention religion at the time when we had arrived in Jerusalem. I painted a picture of my personal experience living through a human rights crisis as a child. I described the reality on the ground of fascism, a police state, colonialism, and most obvious, apartheid and war. But this conflict, and most conflicts in the Middle East, are never presented to us in that way, especially if it's a US ally and major arms buyer from the United States. Little did I know that moving overseas with this experience shaped not only my perspective on life, but how the media operates and shape who I would become as an adult later on. We finally moved back to the United States in 2001, just a few months before 9/11. I was absolutely traumatized. I suffered from what most military service members suffer when they return from Iraq: survivor's guilt. I had suffered also from PTSD and anxiety, and I had to go to counseling for it. I was now living a comfortable life back home in good old Maple Grove, but I couldn't forget what I had left behind and the suffering I knew people there were still enduring. I was now 13 years old, but felt like no one understood what I had witnessed. Gotta get closer to the microphone. While most teenagers at this time were worried about football games, shopping, and partying, I turned to the media, of course, to stay up to date to the war that I had just left behind. But what I got were images that we still see today of Palestinian men covering their faces, bearing guns, and reporters would refer to the Palestinians as Hamas or militants, never just regular people, the people that I saw, people like my family. The media instilled fear into the hearts and minds of Americans to help justify Israel's apartheid and fascist policies on a defense population. I mean, why wouldn't they? Israel buys over $3 billion worth of military-grade weapons from the US each year. It's also the colonial project of Britain and the United States. The media did what the media does best in covering events in the Middle East, and again, they described it as a religious war. And a few months later, the tragic day of 9/11 happened, and immediately the war drums began beating. Although I was young, I was again still 13 years old, I was mature enough to understand that the media was creating this climate of fear that I had mentioned earlier. This anger toward American Muslims was fomented, as seen in the civilization of jihad. That's how Muslims were, and people of the Middle East. I also noticed that right after September 11th, I think it was MSNBC played this video out of Gaza of Palestinians celebrating and clapping and eating candy, when really they had actually planted that video. It was a video from several years prior. But they wanted to dehumanize again and show that Muslims were happy for September 11th, when really that wasn't the case. The media convinced us that the people in the Middle East hated us for our freedoms. They were backwards, savages, and evil. The media encouraged and even justified our country turning into a surveillance state and villainized over a quarter of the world's population, whom are Muslim, because of the horrific actions of a few. It was obvious to me at the time that the solutions to these human rights crises could never be solved with more bombs, more weapons flowing into the region, more killing, and certainly not a media that was acting as the military mouthpiece. Within a few weeks after 9/11, the peers who I thought were my friends abandoned me and said that my people had committed 9/11. The administrative office of the school called me down one day and searched my locker and undressed me to search me. They gave me no reasoning. They just said they were concerned about me, that I might be hurting myself, just coincidentally a few weeks after September 11th. It took one day, one tragedy, one experience. I, like many other Muslims across the nation, were officially an other. And as a Palestinian, I was told I didn't have a home in Palestine due to Israel's ethnic cleansing. And as an American, being Muslim meant I had to try really hard to prove myself that I loved my country and supported its wars. Through these experiences and having lived through apartheid, having lived through a war, and having witnessed our media act as a lapdog to special interest groups, I myself pointed to the media as the source of the lack of solutions we have available to bring us peace, unity, and real justice in the world. I blame the media for Americans' lack of understanding to these issues and empathy for the human casualty on the ground. My story of what I witnessed and what I lived through is only one of thousands of people of life under occupation, I have sat and watched events unfold in Palestine, in Syria, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Libya, in Iraq, and elsewhere, and wonder how in the world can the media continue to be so complicit in Israeli war crimes in Gaza, NATO crimes in Libya and Syria, US arms flowing to dictators in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in Africa, and arming and rising right-wing militias. I found a solution in the media, because that's where people get their sources of news. That's how they learn about the world around them. I found courage and catharsis in pursuing journalism to speak up, not just for Palestinians, but for all people around the world who are suffering and who are being massacred in the name of power, money, and greed, whether it be in Sudan, the Congo, Burma, Syria, Iraq, Central African Republic, China, Mexico, and many more underreported regions across the world. People don't just start killing each other. There is usually a political agenda behind it, and that political agenda is usually resources and money and gas. And in 2009, against all odds, I became the first American woman to wear the hijab while anchoring or reporting the news. Ironically, I actually started my journalism career in St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is a Michelle Bachmann district. So you can just imagine how interesting that was.
It's also called White Cloud.
Yeah, it's been called White Cloud as well. But most of the people that I met there had never actually met a Muslim before. And they'd always thank me for speaking and dressing American. That was the kicker of living in St. Cloud. But after 9/11 specifically, it really changed my life and many other Muslims in this country. Not only were we pushed to speak up for ourselves, but it also pushed us to dig a little bit deeper about our religion. As I mentioned earlier when I began speaking, I grew up in a very secular family, and religion really wasn't a main concern. You know, yeah, we fasted during Ramadan, we went to the mosque here and there. But after 9/11, I really turned away from religion because I thought, how can religion allow any of this? How could religion allow for young men to, get in bombs and jump into, to hit buildings and kill innocent people? But then through educating myself and doing my own due diligence of researching, I realized that these narratives are very carefully crafted. And even the religion of Islam is being hijacked today by a lot of these extremist groups that are running around with, let's face it, with American weapons, with Western weapons. And this is a really big crisis facing our communities today. But the reason I entered journalism, as I mentioned, was really to change the face of journalism in the United States, as I had seen it had failed the public so disastrously. When I wanted to become a journalist, the first people that told me that I could never succeed were my own parents, surprisingly. They had said to me, no one is going to take you seriously. You're Muslim. You're wearing a hijab. People aren't going to hire you. They're always going to treat you differently. They're always going to treat you as suspect. Look at what they say on Fox News. If you're a Muslim and you speak up, you're immediately going to be attacked. You're immediately going to be censored. You're immediately going to be smeared in the media. But that just gave me more courage. That gave me more inspiration to say, this is the time that we have to help change people's perspectives and narratives about what's going on in the world today. And so again, to great odds, I worked in local news as the first American hijabi anchor and reporter. I later interned and worked with Care 11 for about a year. I actually helped launch the 4 o'clock show with Diana Pierce. I was responsible for getting their presence online. It was a pretty proud moment. And I'm still very, very close to the Care 11 crew. They do a lot of fantastic work. But despite how much I learned from my work there at Care 11 and in corporate media news, let's be honest here, even local news doesn't get to the heart of the story, to the root of the story. And this is mostly because of the corporate ownership of the media that provides the public with that very sensationalized junk food style news. Don't get me wrong, Care 11 has a lot of good coverage, but one of the top stories that was being covered during my time at Care 11 that really struck home with me was this story. It was a top story, and they led with it. And it was a story of a woman who had dropped her wedding ring in a lake while she was, canoeing with her husband. He had just proposed to her. And I don't know if you guys remember this story, but it was like a really big story. And the whole gist of this report was that the whole city had come together to find this ring. They had done like this search party, gotten to the bottom of the lake to find this ring, and they found it. And of course, it was an interesting and heartwarming story, but it lacked that depth that I felt was missing in the media. I still felt like my career in journalism wasn't being fulfilled. the whole reason I became a journalist was to challenge the establishment narrative and provide a voice to the voiceless and expose the true costs of war. I then left the corporate media and launched my own personal blog called MintPress, where I freelanced for about 2 years on my own and covered stories that I thought the media was ignoring. I had the opportunity to interview really big names like former Pentagon official Colonel Wayne Quist, who I'm still keep in touch with a lot. And he really opened up my eyes to what was going on in the Middle East. He had worked in the Pentagon, I believe it was the late 70s to the early 80s. And he explained to me why most of the conflicts we see today taking place in the Middle East are because of a US alliance with Saudi Arabia and the funding and arming of terror groups. And I had actually, even though I had been studying about Islam and these, the rise of extremism, I had never made the connection of Saudi Arabia and this really close relationship. And so that was the first time that I really pushed myself and wanted to learn more and focus more on US foreign policy. We get together a lot and we talk about peace and justice, but surprisingly, most people don't really know the root causes of these issues. And that's when Wayne Quist opened up my eyes for the first time on what was taking place in the Middle East and what was driving these terror groups. And also the rewriting of Islam itself was at the hands of this country, Saudi Arabia. And he had exposed to me and provided me with documentation that the Saudis are literally spending billions of dollars on madrasas, I guess you could call them, in rewriting history books, manufacturing Islamic hadith to kind of push this right-wing Islamic movement. And of course, these right-wing Islamic movements are really nothing more than just a divide and conquer tactic. So journalism has really become an outlet for me for the helplessness that I grew up feeling when I suffered from PTSD for several years, the anxiety that I live with every single day because of what I've endured and for the trauma that I carry because of my life in a war zone. And knowing that so many people I left behind are still suffering, whether it be in Palestine or Israel or anywhere else in the world. Providing a voice to the voiceless and covering national and international stories through the lens of social justice and human rights is the whole reason I started MintPress. And I hope more of us can come together in the cause of human rights and know that every life is precious. Because at the end of the day, it really is not about Islam. I know tonight's topic was about Muslims as the other, but it really isn't about the religion of Islam or religion in general. This is a class war being waged by the 1% global elite. We are simply humans struggling in a life for freedom in a world divided by nations. Thank you.